So Paige has turned on a recording, and what we did find since we did this yesterday is that the recording is, we've already had a press request on that recording. So we just want to just advise people that it's just going to be available to the public. So it'll just be posted. That should not change the informality of what we're planning to do. We really want to have a conversation. We will introduce ourselves. We'd like to hear. We are lucky enough that this is a small enough group that we are able to do that. So we have a presentation, but we also want to make sure that we're addressing any questions or thoughts that may come through your mind. So let me introduce myself. I'm Linda Cooper, the Regional Director at for the Taconic region of state parks. And the region that I oversee is the parks and historic sites in Westchester County, Putnam County, Dutchess County, and Columbia County. And I've been there about 9 years. And you may recall I was a village manager in Ossining before that, and the town supervisor in Yorktown. I live in the T-Town area, which really is, I have an Ossining address. So I grew up thinking I was in Ossining until I registered to vote, and then found out that I actually lived in Yorktown, and I'm in the Croton School District. So, I am one of those typical Westchester residents that, is of many communities. And so the Croton Aqueduct, among other things, is essentially in my backyard. Since I'm by T-Town, I'm near the Cortland and Town of Ossining sections of the trail. And when we set out, and also when I worked in Westchester, and I chaired the Yorktown Environmental Conservation Board for many, many years in the 80s, can you believe, 80s to early 90s, and did get a certification in planning. I have an AICP. And so when we've been working on the OCA over many years, it became clear to us that every community handles the OCA in different ways, and that the changes on the people in the board meant that there's really, and sometimes people didn't necessarily even understand what the Old Croton Aqueduct was as it goes through each community. And so we determined that we would create a set of community design guidelines, which are to support communities in their land use decision making. It's just a tool for the toolkit. It's not anything that is regulatory. Parks is not a regulatory agency. Since two of you are DEC, you know that even better than I do, since DEC is a regulatory agency and we are not. So we did, when we started this process, we met with virtually all of the surrounding communities and got input and found out whether or not they were interested. And we did meet with Dana Levenberg, and she and also Karen, the new manager in the village, and both had said yes, this was something they would support and were interested in. And so we did fulfill the creation of this, and what we're hoping to go through it, let people understand what it is, what kind of things are in it, and then see whether or not they can be incorporated into comprehensive plans or into the regulatory framework that the municipalities create. So in your own codes, and that if not, just even implemented and better understood by the people that are reviewing the projects that are coming through. And in particular, there were some projects in Ossining over the last several years where where some of the statements from some of the board members made it clear that they didn't really understand the aqueduct. So we would very much like your feedback, your input, and your assistance in implementation on it. So you want to start moving? You sort of the second. I've already done the second page. I think Paige is controlling the. Oh, well, I'm sorry. The reason she didn't do that, now I know why, was because we wanted to go through and introduce ourselves, not just me, but the other members of our team, and have you introduce yourselves as well. So Paige.
Hi, I'm Paige Barnum. I'm a planner with State Parks. I'm based out of Albany, but as far as my responsibilities for helping the park to plan and be conscientious of all our resources, natural and historic, if you pretty much split the state in half at Syracuse and come east, I do planning work in all of the different regions. So a lot of diverse, great work. Like Linda, I've received my certification through the American Planning Association. So I do have my AICP credentials. And it was really wonderful, to work on this project. I started my planning career with a municipality far away, actually, in Mississippi. But it's nice to, sort of touch base again and refamiliarize myself with, local ordinance and zoning and how a document like this could be, a great asset to the myriad of communities there, all the river towns.
Thanks, Steve.
All right, I'm Steve Oakes. I'm the historic site manager for Old Croton Aqueduct in Phillips Manor Hall down in Yonkers as well. And I've been at it for, I don't know, 7, 8 years now, worked at the aqueduct, grew up in Dobbs Ferry and consequently was pretty familiar with every rock and root on the aqueduct as a kid. My office is now back in Dobbs Ferry, and I'm available anytime you have questions or want to speak about anything.
And then if we could just have you all introduce yourselves and start with John.
Oh yeah, I'm John Ladd. I work with the Ossining Environmental Advisory Committee, the Town of Ossining Environmental Advisory Committee. It's one hat I wear. Another hat is I work part-time. I'm semi-retired from working for New York State DEC, really as a contractor. I've been employed by New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, big long word for a contractor that provides staff for DEC, some DEC activities. And what my activity has been managing projects where we've been mapping the bottom of the Hudson River for a number of years. So I guess that's, my background is in marine geology. So using sonar to map bottom of various water bodies. So that's probably enough of an introduction right there.
That's so cool. Mitzi.
So John and I work together on the Town of Ossining Environmental Committee. I think I've been on this committee since 1990, early 1990s. So I chair it, and just have to mention, Linda, because you said where you live and the whole area. I just recently joined the board of T-Town. Yeah, so I'm really excited about that, and I'm on the board of Hudson River Sloop Clearwater. And just to mention, John is also a fantastic GIS guru. He is an incredible map maker on many levels. But yeah, that's
so cool. Well, that's great. Then you just go by my house all the time, so that's great.
Well, not recently, but and also I consult in food and environmental regulations. Forgot that hat. Yeah.
Great. And Emilio, Mr. Novello.
He's muted.
Technical. Oh, so you're friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct, correct? ACO. What's the ACO? Friends of the ACO, or is that the OCA just spelled?
He needs to unmute himself.
He's on. Yeah, here, FOCA, right? Friends OCA. Yes. Okay. Thank you. So he's a member of the Friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct. Thank you so much for joining us. We had several friends join us the other yesterday. Was it yesterday? We did the other presentation, and we did a presentation for the board as well earlier. And Mr. Sebesta, Lou, you want to introduce yourself?
He's got to unmute himself too.
Okay, so I must have gone off by accident. Yeah, I'm Lou Sebesta. I'm a retired urban forester. Was for the Region 3. By the way, Linda, my part of the DEC was not regulatory. I could lead people to the right decisions to make an enlightened decision, but I couldn't make them. I could not make them save their champion tree or do the plan. I could release the money or not if they're applying for state grants, But anyway, so I was called in by the park manager, Peter, back in the way back when, and for some tree butchery along the old Croton Aqueduct in Yonkers, about 100-foot section of the trail, both sides of the trails. Some fat cats who lived on the east side of the trail wanted a clear view of the, an unobstructed view of the Palisades in Yonkers across the river, across the Hudson. So they end up applying like a professional arborist who should have known better to top the trees, just really cut the whole tops off. It's big, beautiful trees. A lot of them, some are like 25 inches in diameter, just gorgeous trees. So I was called in to assess the damage and basically give an appraisal of the trees, and I gave them full landscape and recreational value, and eventually went to the Attorney General's office for prosecution, and I was working with them for, basically it turned out to be pro bono for a whole bunch of time, even after I retired from the DEC. So anyway, so I think the trail's a great resource, and I think every community needs to preserve their green spaces, because it's good, mental health, physical health, it's great for your morale, for everybody's morale. So I'm all for that. Anyway, so
that's great. And I'm glad to learn that Peter Eskandarian is back, by the way. He's the current manager at the Rockefeller State Park Preserve. So he left at Rockefeller. So he's in Westchester. If you ever
Rockville, yeah, he went up to he came back from
to Moreau Lake in the near Glens Falls before that, in between the Old Croton Aqueduct. But he's back. He's our manager in the region at Rockefeller. If you ever want to stop by and say hello, we're still dealing with tree cutting issues, by the way, and over the years have Ted Kozlowski has worked with us on that, but and Bob Herbiger used to work with me all the time. And when I was in the town of Yorktown. So we very much appreciate DEC foresters. So thank you. It's great that you're in here. So I don't think there's anybody else on the line. There are 3 other people signed up, but they obviously haven't managed to start. So again, our goal here is just really, if I could follow up on what Lou just said, is we believe that the aqueduct is an extraordinary resource. It connects communities. It provides both recreational opportunities. It has historic significance. It's a nationally landmarked structure, and it is also a corridor. It's a nature corridor. It has great value, both biotic value and just I don't know. It's also got a cultural legacy that helps explain the growth of New York City. It has educational value in the story of water and its impact on our lives and on our development. So for so many reasons, we are passionate about Old Croton Aqueduct State Historic Park. And again, our goal here is that we have about 66 feet or so, and sometimes smaller, sometimes larger, corridor going through lots of different communities. And our goal is to see that we don't end up in a tunnel with buildings built right along the corridor, that we don't lose the beauty, and that it is understood for what it is as a true park amenity within the communities, and that the guidelines present each municipality was doing different things. We took many of those practices and put them in here. We took some just best planning practices, and that if there's tools here that you haven't thought of that you could incorporate and use, we hope that they can be of use. And we just really want to also point out what the legal requirements are in the review of the aqueduct. So I think we can move to the next page and go to Steve.
All right, so what is the aqueduct? Well, you probably know it's a 26.2 mile linear park runs from the Croton Dam up in Cortland all the way down through Yonkers into the, well, it connects basically in the Bronx. The old aqueduct continues beyond there. It's not under our management. It's New York City's. The OCA attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Probably, you know, our greatest year may well have been this year. There were some days it was just crazy. A lot of people find it very convenient to come up, hop on a train, you know, walk from one section to another, maybe through a couple of different towns, get back on a train in a different community and continue on home. I always like to say that it's one of these sorts of tourist attractions that's really ideal in the sense of it doesn't require parking for the most part because so many people do come by train. So the history of the aqueduct is fairly simple. It started as a, you know, an answer to a couple of problems in New York City, you know, which was substantially in the lower part of Manhattan in those days. And the city managed to have generally limited water supplies. And on top of that, a lot of it had been polluted. You know, when you've got wells out in the street and outhouses in the backyard and so on, they, you know, mix all right for a while, but ultimately there are troubles. Another issue turned out to be water for firefighting. There were several big fires, the last one in 1834, 36, that were ripped through large sections of New York. And so it was determined that an actual real water supply was needed. They had gone through a couple of false starts with a big well and a steam-powered pump in the 1820s, and that didn't work out. It was ultimately the project, or the goal of creating a water supply was directed to engineers, and engineering was kind of a new thing at this point. Directed to some engineers who basically determined that the Croton River, 41 miles north, was really the proper place to get water from. It had a good supply year-round, decent quality, and so on, and that a gravity aqueduct could be built. There was a lot of canal building going on during these days, so the idea of a channel you know, a man-made channel carrying water was something that was, you know, pretty much in the popular imagination. This aqueduct wound up being a conduit, a pipe underground, as opposed to an open canal-like thing. But one of the original designs called for an open canal with a wooden roof on it. But to prevent freezing and so on, they opted for an underground tube. It's around 8 feet around. It basically is pretty much complete with the exception of a little area at Route 117, which ultimately the reason that was demolished had to do with how the aqueduct became a park. But nevertheless, the tube is intact pretty much the whole way down. When it was opened, it was designed to provide 100,000 gallons of water a day. And that was seen as infinitely more than adequate. I think at the time they thought, you know, 25, 30 million gallons would more than enough per day. Problem was development grew quite rapidly once adequate water was around. And as a consequence, within 25 or 30 years of building the aqueduct, it was determined that its days were numbered in terms of its being able to supply water. By the 1880s, it was no longer meeting demand. There were concerns that if it were shut down for more than 12 hours, that the big receiving reservoir where the New York Public Library is now would run out. And, you know, so there was need for new aqueduct. They built a new Croton aqueduct, hence ours became the Old Croton Aqueduct. And the new one is about 3 times the size of the old. They also built the big dam that we know of now, the Croton Dam. The original dam actually still exists. It's underwater. You probably know the name of the road there up by the filtration plant, but if you drain out the reservoir, there it sits at the bottom. The new aqueduct, or the old aqueduct, continued to supply water into the mid-1960s. And at that point, it was determined that, it's just not worth the maintenance, and so it was shut down. It basically became kind of a big vacuum, and everyone's backyard fence moved out, and the towns decided it was a great place to park the snowplows in the summer, and so on. State Parks ended up acquiring it in '68, and immediately set about eliminating impediments to walking. There were towns, Irvington, for example, put fences at the Dobbs Ferry and Terrytown lines, I guess to keep the hoi polloi out. Other places had decided to fence off for whatever reason sections of it. Homeowners had. So State Parks set about basically eliminating the worst of the impediments. Municipalities had parking lots. Those were generally agreed to, be allowed to continue, and so on. But the goal is basically to keep it enjoyable as a public amenity. There are a variety of challenges that we deal with. View shed protection being one. Some of the views of the Palisades are tremendous, particularly as you get down into Yonkers and Hastings, and yet there's always development going on with buildings going up and so on. There's been obviously tremendous population growth, not only recently, but obviously when the aqueduct was first built, I think Westchester's population was probably about what Ossing's is now. So there's, been a lot of changes. One of the things we deal with is the sort of patchwork of local regulations. There's no uniform setbacks. Some places don't even have setbacks. So, we're always kind of having to look at each and every potential project along the aqueduct in by itself and individually. And finally, we're doing our best, and it's a tough road to hoe, but with education and making folks who live along it particularly aware of what it's about. I don't think, it doesn't look like an aqueduct. I've had more people say to me, "Oh, where's the aqueduct?" And, it doesn't immediately present itself as anything other than either a country road or an alley in some places. So kind of getting folks to understand that is definitely important. Another issue we deal with is the structural integrity of the aqueduct itself. And impacts to that can come in the form of, the obvious things like blasting to, tear apart rock adjacent to it or and properties nearby. But it can also be the moving of heavy equipment over it. We've got lots and lots of streets that cross it, and all kinds of things can occur there with heavy machinery and so forth. Even something as simple as planting of trees by neighbors. They invariably plant the trees a little bit out into the aqueduct if they want privacy, but then the roots of that can impact the aqueduct. We've had issues with the stone slope walls on either side. Well, in places people have decided that they want their yard to go kind of up to the base of the wall and they want it to be level. So they've moved away the earth, which has then caused the wall to be unsafe. So there are a lot of things that we keep our eyes on in terms of keeping the aqueduct in decent shape. And this is where the planning and being made aware of these kind of issues at the municipal level can be intensely helpful to us. So Paige, you're going to tell us a little bit about the design guidelines themselves.
Right. So as the slide suggests, we're going to tell you what design guidelines are. So design guidelines are ultimately written recommendations that are intended to give folks such as homeowners, local officials, planning board members, the architect you might hire to do that addition on your home, clear advice on how to employ best practices in architecture, design, and planning on a project-by-project basis. So generally speaking, design guidelines are developed after a careful study of an area. That area's scale may be anything from a small historic district. It may be a bit larger. It could be design guidelines for a particular neighborhood. It might even be something as expansive as design guidelines for a whole city. Design guidelines are actually intended, though, to be flexible. It's the hopes that design guidelines allow creativity in design. It's the flexibility of the guidelines and their adaptability that helps everyone to avoid those homogenous cookie cutter neighborhoods, and they help us to protect those unique characteristics of your communities that made them a special and interesting place to start with. So ultimately, it's our hope that these design guidelines will be regularly reviewed by local planning officials, preservation boards, and that the recommendations in the document will actually be used in the decision-making process. We want this to be a living document, not something that gets just shoved on a shelf. It's well established in the planning profession that design guideline recommendations, and judicious application of them lead to better design outcomes, rather than haphazard or unanticipated ones. Decisions made after consideration of design guidelines can, enhance architectural traditions. It can introduce new ones, but without, detracting from the remarkable resource of the community, which in this case, is the OCA. So to give you a little bit of background, as Linda, mentioned at the top of the order, so we started this process in fall 2019, doing precedent research and also meeting, with local officials. We met with, village managers, we met with some planning board members, we met with public works superintendents, all those folks that, can be good advocates for the resources in your community. We, met with them to sort of, tell them why we wanted to do this process in the first place. And we also hoped that through these conversations, we might be able to identify if there were any particular concerns in each of the communities that this document could help to address. Subsequent to those meetings, we got to work. We started, researching design guidelines, even in greater depth, writing the document, editing the document, taking the document to subject matter experts. Some of those subject matter experts that we have at hand are, our colleagues at the Division for Historic Preservation. And then in February 2020, we sort of recirculated a draft of this document with the leaders we met with then in fall to make sure that we were on the right track, that they didn't feel like we were totally out of line. And so this document's really unique in that it does strive to give, guidance to many different, many different municipalities, each with their own leaders, their own sort of values. But the one thing that every one of these communities and all the river towns have in common, is an interest in responsibly stewarding the OCA and promoting it as an attraction in your community for families and visitors. And we really want to encourage, that love that we all have for the OCA. So here we are, a little later than we expected. I don't think any of us anticipated, a global pandemic, but we're hoping to roll out the OCA and keep encouraging folks to visit it because, as many of you probably know, and as Steve told you, visitation of the OCA is probably higher than ever, as it's a great opportunity to safely recreate amidst these trying times. So to tell you, oops, there we go. So how can you actually use these guidelines? So the first thing we have here, step one, is to identify the environmental setting in which the proposed project resides. So you might wonder, well, what do you mean by environmental setting? So if you'll bear with me, we're going to impart a hopefully painless urban planning lesson that will sort of give you a background on what we mean by environmental setting. So this diagram you see here on your screen is called the urban-rural transect. And it was a planning model that was developed in the early 2000s by two individuals who were architects/urban planners, Andres Duwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyber. And this model was inspired by the field of ecology, where naturalists frequently study changes in habitat over a gradient. So that gradient could be the change in topography or a distance from, say, a water body. So what the urban-rural transect diagram does is it defines a series of 7 zones. Each of those zones does have its own unique characteristics, and those characteristics may include particular land uses, the extent of physical development. And so the diagram's goal in part is to show the interconnection between human development and the natural environment. how development on land can sort of ebb and flow, and it's not something that happens in isolation. So then how do we connect this to our design guidelines? Well, what we did is we looked at the length of the OCA as if it was its own gradient, and we identified our own zones. So we actually came up with 5 settings, 5 zones that were specific to the OCA. So when we go again to that step 1, identifying the environmental setting, we apply one of those 5 settings we identified, and each of those settings has its own, set of guidelines and recommendations for how individuals can best protect that setting through, the application of those guidelines and those recommended best practices. So I'm going to turn it back over to Steve, and he will explain to you our 5 zones.
All right, now you have a slide that shows 4, and there's a reason for that. But we'll start off with the first of the zones, namely the natural landscape. And the natural landscape areas are typically found, I would say, mostly in the northern section of the aqueduct. However, there are very definitely some of those down in Yonkers, curiously enough. And basically, those are areas that don't have a lot of recent human activity. They may have been developed or intensely used at one point or another, forested, used for animal grazing and so on, or they may have been areas which were just hilly, rocky, steep, what have you, that just made economic development impossible. And there are a number of those kind of throughout the trail. The next section is suburban, and that we all pretty much understand. Residential in character, houses separated. Very often the aqueduct forms the boundary with the backyards or side yards of houses. In some cases, it's a very distinct boundary. In other cases, it's a very smooth melding from one to another. There are places where the aqueduct has 40 and 50-foot berm walls on the sides of it. And in that case, it can be fairly distinct and, in a sense, never the twain shall meet. And that if you're on the trail, the yard that's 50 feet lower is just looked over as you look at a river view or whatever. We next come to the village center. The aqueduct passes through a number of them. That's Ossining there, but also Tarrytown, Irvington, Dobbs Ferry, Yonkers certainly. Most of these communities existed when the aqueduct was built. In many cases, the aqueduct is a little narrower than its usual 66 feet, simply because it was kind of prime developed land back when it was built. The land use in these areas obviously tends to be, mixed residential, but with closer buildings, a lot higher density, and the buildings not only are closer themselves, but very often closer to the trail itself. Roads tend to be busy. It's a very different environment from the others. And finally, we move along to the city center, which, that's mostly parts of Yonkers, but not exclusively, but, dense construction, commerce, residential offices, and so on. But there's not a whole lot of undeveloped land unless it's part of a park.
Looks like we lost Steve for a minute here.
Oh, I'm lost.
You were lost
Am I
for a
back?
second. Let's see if we
Am I
can get you back.
Okay, very good. Did you get city center? You all get that, right?
Yep, you can go on.
That's where you were.
So then we have finally the sort of outliers, what we euphemistically term the special districts, which are basically things that are not really appropriate for a park. They're incongruous. Sometimes they don't really prevent the use as a park. Kind of other areas they really do. In this case, we've got parking lots, municipal parking lots. We have them in Irvington and Dobbs Ferry and Hastings. In other cases, we've got diversion in the route of the aqueduct because of things like the New York State Thruway. You know, the aqueduct in that case, basically you can walk that straight into a sound barrier wall and then have to backtrack and go around. Some of the special districts are on the periphery of the trail. There are a lot of those in Yonkers that are parking lots, and they're pretty good sized lots. They might hold 50 or 60 cars, but they're, you know, taking up 20 feet along the west side of the trail, and the rest of it is wooded. So they don't really materially interfere with park use, but others have. And as organizations, you know, we had one in Hastings, or rather one in Terrytown at a church, which no longer needed its parking lot. And so that we were able to remove the pavement and turn that back into an actual walking trail, you know, grass trail. So, you know, we try to take care of those as we can, but you can't do, you know, you can't do everything. So Paige, back to you.
All right. So for each of the environmental settings that Steve just outlined, those 5 zones, we gave in our document sort of, you know, specific guidance for how to best, you know, things to watch out for in each of those zones, and, you know, things to be mindful of. Those specific details, what to watch out for might be anything from landscaping treatments to lot coverage, you know, recommendations, all in the hopes of respecting the defining qualities of the OCA. So the things that folks need to watch out for are certainly varied by setting, and we didn't delve into each of those, you know, the specific nuances of the guidelines in this presentation. But when someone is in a position to, you know, issue a board ruling, we do want folks to look at those details and, you know, talk them out. And ultimately, the better, you know, informed each of our boards are, the better job we can do collectively to help protect the OCA and, you know, the environmental setting in which it sits. So after boards have sort of figured out, you know, which of the zones they think is most appropriate for the project they're evaluating, we encourage them to look at the next section of the design guidelines, which are some general design principles, and, you know, sort of walk through each of those principles. There are actually some prompts, some questions to sort of encourage that conversation at meetings. So we will do a quick review of those design principles, and I will forewarn you, I am not an architect, so I'm doing my best here to convey these principles. But the first one is setback. You can see the little arrows there on the ground towards the red line, and a setback is essentially that distance between the property line and an accessory dwelling unit, what have you, and the property line, which in this instance is usually our park boundary. Scale is the next design principle that we would love to encourage folks to be sensitive to. You can also see another line there sort of floating above the rooftops of those homes, but scale is the relative or apparent size of a building or a structure in relation to, you know, in this instance, our trail. Our third design principle is height, pretty self-explanatory. 4 is massing. It's that perception that a building or structure gives off. So if you're standing in the middle of the trail, does it feel like the massing of a building is looming over you, that it's, you know, very unwelcoming, uninviting? And to be sensitive to ways that you might, you know, mitigate that big blocky massing. For example, it might be easy to sort of set back that next story or third story to, you know, open up the air around the aqueduct. Next, we talk about facade composition, which is the, you know, overall arrangement of materials on the face or sides of a building, because in many instances, you know, it's not necessarily the front of a building that faces the aqueduct, but a side of the building, or, you know, many times it's the rear of a building. So we want to make sure that people are sensitive to the fact that those elevations should have some design thought put into them, that it's not just a blank back wall. We also talk about rhythm as a good design principle, the arrangement of structural and architectural elements on a feature. It could be the position of a windows, if they, you know, are cogently sort of placed, or if they're kind of haphazard, or just one window over there and 3 down here. We also, last but not least, are very sensitive to viewshed preservation, preserving that sight line to the Hudson River, or if you're, boating on the river, what can you see back into town? And if you just see an endless, monotonous wall of buildings, when you could see some, variation and some greenery, we encourage folks to be sensitive to that. I will turn it to Linda.
So we're asking for you to read through the guidelines. We sent them to each of the municipalities and asked that they were going to distribute them to the different board members. Did you guys receive a copy from Austining, for instance? Mitzi? You did, okay. So what we would love is for people to think about whether or not, I know Austining's going through a comprehensive plan. A number of the communities are updating their comprehensive plans now. I'd love to see whether these can be either by incorporated with some of the language or by reference, whether they could be adopted in part as a part of your own local design guidelines or any other kinds of amendments to the zoning code, for instance, with buffers or overlays or any of the other things that are discussed.
I did see that. I did.
You did. Oh no, I saw you shaking your head. I knew. I got it. Thank you.
I was looking it up. Yeah.
And then in addition, even if there are parcels that you see that you think would be critical, that we should consider for land preservation. In addition, this is a corridor. We're not really expanding the park, but sometimes there are things that just should get absorbed into the parkland as additional buffer lands. So I think that or easements. One of our goals, once we kind of get this one set into, and I've rolled it out, we've been bit by bit working on encroachments. And, some things were allowed by permit when the DEP was just sort of wondering what it was going to do with its, with this aqueduct after it stopped using it as a major water source. And so those permits, the state inherited, and we've supported them. We try not to issue new permits other than for utilities. There are a number of utilities inside the empty parts of the aqueduct in the lower part of the county. But we are hoping to reclaim as much of the aqueduct where there are encroachments and could use municipal assistance and support on that as well. But so the design guidelines are specific to just helping the various boards. And I know you guys are on the Environmental Conservation Board, this, your advisory to the other boards, but if you could give us some feedback or thoughts or, as to how you would like to, how you see these being able to be used, it'd be great. Mitzi, thoughts? Unmute yourself. Thoughts?
Yeah. I'm looking through it now. I didn't look at it before this wonderful session, but I'm just looking at a map here, and I know John is so in tune to maps, but I'm wondering, is there a list by municipality? Like you flip to the Austining section and exactly where the aqueduct follows through in that municipality and what businesses, areas are impacted by or could potentially be impacted by this design document and should be aware, people should be aware of. So
we have the trail maps, but we don't have a great survey. So if that would definitely be an interesting challenge in Austining because there's so much development downtown development adjacent to the aqueduct. It would be interesting to see what our actual there are buildings on the aqueduct in Austining. So that I don't believe ever had any kind of permission to be there. So
the town
go on.
The town GIS maps do a pretty good job.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure we could pretty quickly generate a map that shows the parcels.
The only problem I find with a lot of them is that they tend to blend municipally or publicly owned land together. So when the aqueduct nears a street, then, it's just sort of, they blend together and it's a street and the aqueduct and there's no real property line. But in general, I think the GIS maps are certainly useful. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good.
And we generated a larger map. We did a management plan a number of years ago and did create a very long map. It just wasn't survey map. It was off of GIS data of all the municipalities, and that we could share that as well. The sections we have of that for your communities. That might, and we're happy to share that plan as well. That's more an internal document for the park to use as it looks at maintenance on the aqueduct and some of the strategic plan things. So that's a good point. So thank you. So the other part of this, the slide that Pages has put up, is that there are some regulatory requirements, that we do have, such as seeker. And under seeker, the Old Croton Aqueduct has to be identified as a historic resource. And so most of the municipalities are very good about sending us notices. And every time we get a notice, if it comes to me, I scan it and send it down to Steve for him to take a look at what's going on. Our bureau at the Division of Historic Preservation also has a land use review group that will sort of look at it. They probably don't look always as hard at our region because they know we look at it, but the State Historic Preservation Act, which is the section 1409, kicks in whenever anybody has an application to do anything around the aqueduct. And we work very closely when people do come in. And Mercy College had some work recently. We actually get many of the developers, when they're doing things anywhere around the aqueduct, do contact us, and we have been working with them to ensure that whatever is done in our vicinity, it works, is done well. I think Steve's been in with to do confined space entries when they're looking to see what would be the impact of blasting that might be not on anywhere right on there, but close enough that they're worried about what the impact might be on the aqueduct. So we're grateful to, again, that collaboration we've been able to achieve. But so there are a few, the National Historic Preservation Act and the State Historic Preservation Act kick in on any reviews around the aqueduct. And even though the Croton Dam is in the county park, our state park starts really embedded inside that park. So it's we're actually working with the county, I think, to ultimately create some we know we need better signage and wayfinding for the aqueduct. And that will certainly be a future project. We're working on, some of the structural integrity issues that periodically come up. And some of them come up because people decide to do things like dig into the side of a hillside near an aqueduct. And that actually has an impact. So it may not have an impact the year they do it, but it may have any impact 20 years later or 40 years later. And so I think, we're trying to create that level of awareness that people know that this is a park.
Yeah,
and that there are impacts, as we said, that could be structural, that can be environmental, that can be in terms of its popularity as a recreational resource and other things. So we hope you find these guidelines useful. We appreciate any input and thoughts and any suggestions you have as to how we can make them better known and utilized.
One question that comes to mind for the town of Ossining, do you have your own list of problem areas on the park corridor in the town?
We have a
we
list.
Should be looking at?
You mean encroachments?
Well, for instance, encroachments, I don't know if that's the only.
So we have encroachments, and yeah, we probably do. Steve probably is more aware of when there are certain areas of the trail where we have constant graffiti or trashing of the trail and things like that. So if that's what you mean.
Yeah, that's part of what I mean, I guess. I just wondering, I guess, if you could provide the town EAC with things you'd like us to look at and go out and look
Absolutely.
at them.
Sure. Ossining is actually pretty good. It's probably one of the most, kind of aware, cognizant of the aqueduct communities there is, which is,
Yeah.
I think maybe had something to do with the urban cultural park that was done back in the 90s. But it seems to be pretty well respected in Austin. It may not be perfect, but it's pretty good.
Well, we just opened up in the village. We just took down a fence. There was an area that was fenced off
Yep.
behind Spring Street. So that the people were forced to go on to the Spring Street instead of on the trail.
Mhm.
So I mean, there are things that are just not really, I think, looked at as the trail. The Ossining Rec Department actually maintains some of the trail in Ossining.
Yep.
So, but we can certainly look to see what we have both in encroachment or in complaint.
Yeah,
If there are any, and share them
just
with you.
kind of things, that we might be able to help in some way just by being aware.
That would be great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it'd be great.
When were those signs put together? I feel like they're fairly new, the OCA,
The routed out signs.
the stick sign, yeah, the posts. When were they installed?
So how long have you been there? Because they went, Steve, because I think Gary Ritchie put them in.
Yeah, they were mostly Gary. They were talking about the green loca, wooden posts.
So I think it's,
Yeah.
On a lot of your,
I'm 9 years at Parks. I think it was the first year that I was there. So it's about 9 years ago.
That sounds about right.
because I feel like I just noticed them on the Rockefeller trails, where it kind of meshes into Rockwood, where they merge
Mhm.
Rockefeller and, well, I mean, it's all part of the Rockefeller, I guess, State Park, but, because I think it's curious that a lot of people may not know what OCA is.
That is, yeah, that's come up. It's an awful long name to put on a sign,
Of course.
but it has come up as an issue. You're right.
So
I mean,
we know
even
that
one
wayfinding,
side.
we know that wayfinding is a real issue on it, and we need to do more on that. And as our interpretive signs, there's an interesting, not dynamic or tension between. There are many people who think it's better to not be overt in the signage and to have it be this subtle country path that goes through the municipalities and don't want to see a lot of signage. And there's been the discussion has been on, how do we allow people to know it's there, know that they're in the right location, and not turn it into something more urban feeling.
Like a rail trail.
So that's I think they're valid points on all sides. So we will try to balance that whenever we get to being able to fund a wayfinding program. But I think that you're right. Many people have no idea what those little signposts are that say OCA. It's like you have to be in this secret place that you know. So
Maybe
and we have
provide
a
some
few
mystery.
detours going around the GE site, the Learning Center. You have to know where to go. I mean, all of a sudden you're coming out onto Ogden Road and you can't go
Yeah.
straight across. But there is a little spur that goes straight across. It's just you hit Route 9A. And then you go,
Right.
what? You
Yeah.
have to turn, some people don't know that you have to turn down and walk around.
And do you know Gareth Hutham?
I do.
Because he is so clued into, and I'm sure you guys are too, into signage, where he worked on the Sing Sing Kill. Remember that, John? And he
Yep.
put all those fish signs together. And
Mhm.
I know, like you want to strike that balance. I understand that, where you don't want to overly inform people. But you mentioned a railroad trail. I don't know if you're referring to these, where you have the post and you have, kind of like a plaque where it gives you the history of where you are and the Croton, a lot of the information that you presented tonight could be so interesting to people.
I think so too. Yeah. The river walks are a good example where we're trying, where most of them do not have,
Exactly.
you have those kiosks. Some of them are those stanchion kiosks with lots of information. And I think that there's great opportunity for good signage here. And I'm looking forward to being able to have that be a project. It's just given the current fiscal situation, I don't know that it's in the next couple of years, but hopefully, either through grant or through state funding, maybe we'll be able to get that out. I think it's a real need. People, the education will help. We do programs for school kids and for adults, but that reaches only a small number of people. I mean, most people don't, many people don't know that you can actually go into the weir in Ossining. And it's just so fascinating. I mean, just the whole history of this park, of this aqueduct, and its impact on New York is riveting in many ways. And I think that we're just trying to make sure it stays preserved as that country path and as that beautiful place. And the number of people that have used it always, but in particular this year with the pandemic, it is an accessible, wonderful place that can give you a long walk, a short walk,
It's an engineering marvel that some signage, the kind of just modest signs like we have on the T-Town trails.
Yep.
Right. I don't
That's
think those
not
are
great signage, but we've got
but
good signage at many of our other parks. I agree.
It's not overwhelming big signs.
Right.
Something that would inform people about the engineering aspects of it. I think that's just awesome.
So if you go on, even if you're on the North County Trailway, the South County Trailway, they have, periodically near the depots, they'll have a sign that tells you a little bit about the history, and those are good signs.
Yeah.
So, and we have some signage down in Dobbs Ferry. That's interpretive signage. We had some signs I think, where we were setting some up in Yonkers, but we need more, way more, all over. And Natalie McIntosh, when she did that great exhibit that is still relevant in the Ossining Community Center, as part of the where the Sing Sing and Ossining, it's a great place for people to also learn about the aqueduct. So.
Well, this was a great start too. I mean, I don't know if I'd call it a start, but this was a fabulous tool to learn more and what can be done going forward. Just, and also just with the whole pandemic thing where, as you say, people are flocking in droves and have been over the year, which is the silver lining to this crazy world we're in right now. But, how it's just such an important asset. And John, you said something, what did you call it? It's something marvel.
Engineering marvel. No, I mean, the engineering that went into both the aqueduct and the railroad in the 19th century is it's amazing. And
it's gravity fed. It's an amazing thing. It's like the Roman aqueducts. Lou, do you have any comments?
Well, I agree with John. I mean, it is a engineering marvel. It's actually a visionary marvel that people had they had the vision early to like incorporate it, in part of our just a regional community resource, and recreational resource. And because with the increased urbanization, we're desperate for greenery and green space and natural exercise instead of like gyms and things like that can be very hazardous to our health if we try to do things, pump iron in a kind of enclosed space and things like that. So I'm glad to have been a part of the aqueduct's history, the trail's history, and and trying to preserve it against encroachment and some serious, destruction of some of the key natural amenities of the trail. It's especially in such highly urbanized area of the state. I think it's a really essential resource, and I'm glad that I think you're continuing to I'm glad you've all been involved in this. Unfortunately I'm living in Rensselaer right now.
That's a nice part of the state too.
Yeah, I'm living in a house that used to be part of the Underground Railroad.
Oh my
Oh,
God.
very cool.
Got like $1 million view of the Albany skyline across the river, but it's unfortunate. I have the largest construction and demolition landfill at the top of the hill that my street is on, so that is not good. And I'm working with the Rensselaer Environmental Coalition to try to remediate issues with that and actually close the thing down, but it's a monumental fight. So in fact, I need to get back now because I'm working with a team of a group here, a community group of it's a multiple community groups trying to looking for some try to preserve our community actually. And so and I need to bow out. I gracefully need to bow out now.
We're just about done. I'm just taking questions. So thank you for joining us.
I will peruse all that. I got the link to the full plan. I will look at it. I think you're definitely on the right path. I'm going to use that was unintentional to continuing preserve the resource and look at it after and being good stewards of the OCA. So carry on, and I applaud you.
Yeah, thank you for your help, Lou.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for taking the time to come in. Mr. Novella, last out. You have anything to say? Did you get your oh wait, I see you put into the chat. Is that what you did? Tarrytown and Yonkers routes are challenging. Signage along bypasses are missing or removed. And you're right, without the Friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct maps, it's impossible to find the bypass routes. And thank you for the
Yeah,
invitation.
signage is going up bit by bit. Signs are going up in those locations. We keep having, one has been removed forcibly 2 times now by Lyndhurst. But yeah, we are putting up additional signs. One went up fairly recently by GE, and there are more designed. It's just a matter of getting them fully planned, approved, and created, and then the posts put in the ground and so on. But there are more coming, all based on the Friends map.
That's great. So thank you for that comment. Sorry, you did not get the technology to allow you to say it, but glad you typed it in the chat. We've gone a little bit past where we want, but we started a little earlier too, right? So I started a little late while we were waiting. So we don't need to keep you any longer. Thank you very much for joining us, and
Thank you.
this proves useful to everybody. So thanks so
Take a look
much.
at
We'll be in touch.
your document. Yep.
Good. Thank you, folks.
Great night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thanks, Steve.
Good night.
Good night.
Supper time.
Yes.